That is...
Hey, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of AngularAir, the TypeScript edition. No, I don't know. We're going to be talking TypeScript today. We're going to talk about how much TypeScript do we really need to use in our Angular applications. Should be a fun discussion show. Let's say hi to everybody that's here, and we will get into the topic. Mike's here today with us. Mike, what's going on?
I'm going to buckle up for type safety.
All right. Nice.
I dropped that for dramatic effect, but I'm the only one that saw it. So
it happened. I was going to say, I was tweeting. What did you do? Show it again.
Oh, this one? This is my buckle up for type safety sticker.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was kind of focused on doing the intro to the show, so I really didn't notice your sticker drop. Sorry. We can rewind it later, though. Do a highlight. That's what we need. Is like a little transition, then a quick highlight clip of what just happened. We turns into like a sports show. Didn't we have a sports rep? Yeah. Okay. Alyssa, what's going on?
Not much. Glad to be here.
Awesome. We're talking TypeScript today. We're going to talk about what, we know that Angular leverages TypeScript. So I guess we'll start by talking about how much TypeScript is required, like facts required for us to do our Angular stuff. And then maybe, for sure, talk more about like the thought process around when do we TypeScript? How much do we TypeScript? What does it mean? What do we run into? What do we get benefits and maybe some challenges, that sort of thing. Sound good?
I think you should probably have like a disclaimer of like, even if we tick you off, we are not meaning to, like.
I'm sure there's certainly plenty of opinions, right, that people have and experiences, and for sure. So that'll be fun. We kind of talk about things. Good. I think that we tend to generally try and talk about in terms of this is what we've experienced, and these are things to think about, and not be too vocally opinionated about this is what you got to do. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see. Maybe that'll change this episode. Maybe some things will be revealed this time. So I don't know.
Unless you catch Mike late at night. I was thinking we should have like an AngularAir at night, where it's just hey Lance, good to see you. And Gleason and Eric, everybody in chat, good to see your faces.
A night show would be a bad idea.
Oh, why? Because you would take too many people off with your strong nightly opinions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. I thought that was why. Okay, cool.
Like I've hit my limit. I get there towards the end of the workday, and then like the evening just makes it even worse as I stew over things, and then by the time night rolls around, forget about it.
Yeah, no,
forget about it. The moon comes out and it's over.
My wife has told me to shut up and stop talking about TypeScript types one too many times.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
She's over there laughing.
Oh.
All right, so in our Angular apps, right, we know that TypeScript is a thing. Like if we were going to use the least amount of TypeScript we wanted to use in writing our Angular apps, what would we say that baseline would be? We're talking like we got decorators, right?
Well, JavaScript, we would just switch to JavaScript files.
I
think that puts us under the bar, though. I don't
think you can.
Like, how are we going to decorate a component?
I don't think you can get away without TypeScript in an Angular app today, unless you've done it. Can you? Like, can you fully get rid of TypeScript?
You used to be able to. I don't know if you can, but the question is, do you want to? I think finding the balance of having some types as part of your application for a better dev experience is a good thing. Whether or not that makes sense for everybody, I don't know, but for me it does, and everybody needs to like what I like. That's a nighttime opinion.
It's night Brocco. Well, it's like day and night mode. So we'll certainly talk about that. But like in terms of the baseline, right? Like when we spin up an Angular application, we start building that. We need to decorate our component classes with that component, right? Our services, if we're going to inject stuff into it with that injectable. When we're using those decorators, we're leveraging TypeScript there to then provide all that support, right? So if we were to say we didn't want to use TypeScript at all, we would have to have a way to tell Angular that this is a component class, right? That this is a service that can be injected in. I don't know if there's a way to do that right now. Does anybody know?
Would you have to create providers on your no?
So you can get an ng module, right? Tell what class is the ng module.
I think if you did find a way around it, I would question if you were writing Angular. Seriously. Because the Angular team made that decision. I was like on the edge of my seat when they were making that decision after we left and we were in 2 and beyond. My team really, I know you can all make fun of me for this, was rooting for CoffeeScript. We were like, hey, and then we were hoping that it would at least be, Mike is like, God, he's like, no CoffeeScript. We're hoping it would at least be an option to where you could decide what you wanted. Okay, yeah, I'm going to swap out the TypeScript today with CoffeeScript. But I remember they made a very opinionated decision. We are going in this direction. So even if you found a way around it, are you doing Angular anymore? Or are you just doing some kind of weird mismatch of?
Yeah, and I think to be clear, like we're having the discussion to get the baseline of what is, to start off with, like what is required in terms of TypeScript and Angular, right? Not whether it's good or not, or whether we're not happy with it, right? It's more of like, okay, what is like the requirement, right? Because I think that like all of us probably feel that, hey, this feels good, right? This feels right. But baseline wise, I feel like TypeScript is there because there's the need to do decorators, and decorators were not a thing that we could do with native JavaScript. And so to solve that problem, leverage TypeScript to do so at the time. And now that became that coupling of Angular to TypeScript, right? Because needed to be able to decorate components and modules and things like that.
Right.
So I'm wondering if, as decorators become a thing in JavaScript, native JavaScript, is that something that then removes that requirement of TypeScript to implement that experience? So I think that like
I don't want to get to that point. I don't want to get rid of TypeScript. I want more TypeScript versus less. But I think what our discussion today isn't whether or not TypeScript is or isn't the right choice. It's how much. So the degree and the amount of TypeScript specific stuff that you need or want to write, and how can you reduce some of that or use the types that are there to do less manual stuff. And I think that's kind of the point that we were talking about as we were getting ready for the show and talking about what the things that we wanted to talk about. The meta talk. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
so the reason I bring up this baseline is because if we talk about TypeScript on its own, right? I'm going to use TypeScript to write JavaScript somewhere else, framework agnostic, right? We can activate TypeScript and then never write TypeScript and it'll still be fine, right? You're basically opting into how much TypeScript you want to use, right? And so when I talk about this baseline, I'm saying, well, in Angular, are we really in that situation as a baseline, right? Could we say, oh, we're going to have TypeScript, but we're just going to slowly decide to start using it? I don't think that we can, because Angular has a coupling to TypeScript at some degree, right? In that baseline. So I think that's like when we get into TypeScript and talk about that in terms of that in JavaScript, that's the difference, right? That's the parameters that we're playing with right now when we're writing an Angular app and TypeScript, is that you can't truly just like not use TypeScript at all, but still have TypeScript activated. Not that you would want to or anything, right? I'm just saying that like that, kind of get the concept. Because when we talk about TypeScript, I think a lot of times I hear people think, that I've got to adopt TypeScript. I'm typing all the things. It's all or nothing, right? And I always try and describe this as saying, like, when you take on TypeScript, you could literally just keep writing JavaScript and then slowly start adding types as you need, right? That's one of the beauties of TypeScript, is that it's just transpiling down to JavaScript and it's providing you syntax that does that transpilation, right?
Yeah. I've had that conversation as well. Well, what's the first step when you're migrating from JavaScript to TypeScript? And quite frankly, the first and easiest step is rename your files.
Yeah.
Like don't change any code. Just change the file extension. And then
JS to TS,
and then
right?
a build step. But yes.
Same thing.
And that's great.
Trying to like learn Sass, right? Just change the file name.
You could.
That's where it starts.
You
Same
could
concept, right?
Can't you?
Mm.
Because CSS
Well, for SCSS, yeah, you can just
Yes.
say .scss and then it's all valid. So it's the same thing with like, because it is all valid JavaScript at the end of the day, right? So, well,
Right.
Yes. Well, depends on if you're writing stuff that works.
And so that's where it starts, right? Is that understanding that TypeScript is a transpiler, Sass is a transpiler, right? And it's providing us a way to write the code in a way that's going to help us or make us more efficient or productive or whatnot. But at the end of the day, it's just transpiling it down to JavaScript. And that's another thing of like, do I take on TypeScript? Do I want to invest in TypeScript? I always kind of talk about the fact of like, yeah, do it. Because at the end of the day, if you're like, I don't like this, I want to get out of it. Well, you just run the transpiler and get all your JavaScript, and now you have your JavaScript to work with from there on out, right? So it's kind of like a opt-in adoption that's feels very comfortable to take on and not feel like you're committing to a whole nother language, right? It's not like jumping from like PHP to C# or something like that, right? So if we say the baseline's that, so we're kind of like, okay, look, we've got some coupling of Angular TypeScript, so we're there. That's fine. Now from there, how much do we start TypeScripting all the things, right? I kind of want to talk about that and kind of get into, maybe we start talking about the benefits of what TypeScript is giving us across the board, and then dive into why and when.
I was looking at Gleason's comment about TRPC. Have you guys heard about it?
Yeah, I actually had a conversation, found some issues. There's some issues out on the Angular repo about TRPC. I don't want to get into that because that's kind of outside the scope. That's more ecosystem versus just language choices. Right. But I don't think anything specific is getting added to Angular, but I think you can do some TRPC stuff with how things are right now. But it's been almost 2.5 years since I looked at that. So for but I know there's issues on the Angular repo you can go check out.
It looks like it's just an end-to-end type safe API thingy. Like a little toolkit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what does it do?
For a different day.
Yeah.
I'm more
Mike's
worried.
Like, say no to TRPC.
Well, I think
for now,
you gotta clean up your own stuff first and organize your own stuff before you start talking to other systems. So we're talking about inside the browser, how you run your code locally within your application, and then how do you communicate those types with other systems, being a backend through an API. So I think what we need to talk about today, or our plan to talk about today, is inside the front end ecosystem. How do you structure your types? How do you utilize the tooling that TypeScript gives you, and how much of that are you using?
And so the RPC remote procedure call, T for TypeScript, is that what we're talking about here? This is something that
I think it's just it's a typed remote procedure call, and
okay,
yeah.
So that'll be great.
Somebody may or may not,
be implementing it
on that.
But that's going to be part of our discussion here today is when we get to the concept of, when we're using TypeScript, when we start strongly typing things, it gives us visibility into what the expected structure is of something, right? Or expected behavior of something is. And then how do you get to the point where you want to reuse that across places, but then you also need to be concerned about coupling, right? And then portability. And so that whole concept of one side front end talking to a back end and how you keep common types across that and things. I think all that's going to play out in our discussion here today.
Agreed.
Cool.
So yeah, but going back with the starting point, that you're basically starting with no types aside from class types. That you have a class, and basically this instance of a class is a type that Angular's dependency injection is using to say, hey, when you when a class gets created and for dependency injection needs one of these things, I know where to go and get it. And it's doing that through the type of what is being injected in. And I think that's our baseline. And then how do you utilize any other types within there? So you're injecting a class. Super. How do I use that? What's available on that class? What are those functions? Are those properties? And what are the types of those things? And how do we set those and utilize those elsewhere?
Yeah. And then how do we control the API signature for it? How can we leverage TypeScript? There's a lot of cool things that we can do, right, with TypeScript that can help us in our application architecture to help people and other teams, other code that uses our application code across the board to be more efficient and to understand it better, right?
Yeah, and it's not just the initial coding of those types, but also the maintenance of those. Well, hey, our backend is now passing us additional parameters, or we're getting additional properties associated with a type. How do we then handle that and accommodate that in our consuming code?
So let's start with like a component. Let's maybe start with a component class, right? And we're creating a new component class. And we can talk about like the things that usually go in that component class and how we use TypeScript inside of there. All right. Does that sound like a good starting point?
Sounds good to me.
All right. All right. So let's say,
are we just going to be talking about this, or are we going to be showing code? I'm good either way.
I mean, I am more than happy for you to pull up your editor and instruct you on what to type. Or you can type whatever. Yeah, we can do it either way. I was just going to start with talking, but yeah, whatever we feel like everybody warms up the old VS Code. That's cool too.
I'm firing up a new repo.
You just did so well the last couple episodes of doing it on the fly.
I don't want to hear it.
You don't need any convincing. It's just going to happen. All right.
What are we going to call it?
Night Mike, don't come out, Night Mike. I'm not ready for you yet.
Simply requesting the presence of daytime, Mike.
Daytime,
Thank you.
All right, so we've got a component class, right? And maybe the main things that we start thinking about is inputs and outputs, right? And that's another example of how we're decorating class fields with the input and output decorators, right? And so we're doing that for Angular to tell Angular that this is an input, this is an output, do your thing. And we're leveraging TypeScript decorators to do that, right?
Yeah. I think I want to do what we did before and work in a single file. So while I created an Angular project, I think that if we just create a single TypeScript file, we can still talk about the types within there and how we utilize those. This way we're not flopping around or switching around.
I love it. Let us see
this
this file.
I haven't created the file yet. I mean, that's a lot. I mean, now we want to do file creation.
Did you forget your generators already? Your schematics?
Are those still a thing?
Mike,
you ready?
Yeah.
All right.
Let's see if I can size this so that it's a little bit more appropriate.
Mike's so good at doing this on the fly. Love it.
Good.
Yeah.
Also, Mike in his dark mode. It always makes me feel like we're legit, like, oh, and anytime you share a website, it looks foreign to me because it's in dark mode. And I'm like, what site is this? Where are we? And it's just like normal docs. And I'm like, oh, I see. He's all fancy with his dark mode. Anyways. Oh, cons should be dark. True.
That's a good starting point. So as we look, should be dark is true. But really, we want it to be a Boolean, but that's okay.
And if you'll notice, should be dark doesn't have a type.
It does.
Oh, we're jumping forward. Okay.
Sorry.
All right. So do we want to throw up a component class here?
I could watch him type all day. It just brings such satisfaction and joy.
You want me to aim the camera down at my keyboard?
Your typers. Call them your typers. Okay.
And then you're going to need to put your mic on your keyboard so we can have the ASMR episode that we talked about. All right. All right. Stay focused. I'm getting us off track here. Okay. So we got this class component, right? So we know in order to tell Angular that it's a component, we got to decorate it with the @component decorator.
You want me to add that?
Yes, I think he wants you to add that. And then also, If while you're adding that. Now, decorators are just like, things in JavaScript. So can't we just like sub it out real quick with JavaScript bits? No. Oh, that's a funny selector. That makes me giggle. Look at how smooth he types. He tippity types.
That was bothering me. Okay.
Oh, I see.
All right, so we've decorated with it. We use the at component decorator, right? Got some TypeScript in there. We're going to add an input and an output. We're going to need to do the.
Oh, we're doing all these. Okay. What are we at? What is Alyssa taking in?
Coffee.
Yeah, coffee. Sounds good. And just don't type it right now. Yeah, just semicolon out. Yeah. And we'll do output. And make it.
Drank. Woo. Equals new event. Ooh.
No, I'm adding no types, but that's okay.
All right.
Do you want me to turn off this extension that shows us errors in line or no?
No, I think the errors are good because then we can talk about the fact that like that error is getting thrown by TypeScript and linting telling us that is it because we have strict mode on?
I believe strict mode is turned on. So if I go to, what is that? The TS config. Yep, strict is on.
Yeah, and that's because you just generated it, right? Like I think
Isn't that a default? Yeah, but I think that came with maybe 13.
Yeah.
So we talked about before that TypeScript is kind of like an opt-in. You just scale up how much you want, right? You also have these settings that can help you scale faster, I guess, or start, requiring faster. So strict mode, when we have it on, it's going to, be more aggressive about making sure that we're typing all the things or getting closer to typing all the things, right?
Yeah. And to be clear, I just turned off strict mode and that error went away.
Right.
But you still have the underline of the coffee. Hover over the C. Yeah.
So it becomes
now it's just a suggestion. Like what? What is that?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's telling you, hey, this you might want something here, but this is valid, code, right? Like we could write this code, we could ship this to production. It's not impacting us anyway, right? We're still shipping the same product. So we start with deciding like how much do we want to go down this TypeScript journey, right? And I think like the strict mode is the thing that like kind of I worry a little bit about it, about people understanding like having it on, like what you're agreeing to by starting with strict mode true, right? That's like now you're typing the majority of the things.
If you have it on true, besides giving the warning, does it let you run the app? Like it's not gonna
fail.
Okay.
I think build might pass. I don't know if build will pass or not, but linting will fail. So it's kind of like, okay, look, if I have strict mode on, I'm basically in the boat of having to, do TypeScript in a lot of places. And that's fine, certainly fine. Like it'll help you and your teams ensure that you're meeting that need, right? But having an understanding, like, are you ready and wanting to buy into that need right off the bat, right? So, like I said, without strict mode on, and we don't have this check, then we can see that like this is valid code that we could ship, right? So then at this point, it becomes, okay, what do we do? Do we want to type that? Do we get value out of that? Like how far do we take this? And so, in coffee, right now we named it coffee, but what are we going to store in that, right? So I think most of us lean towards, it's going to be beneficial to define what that type's going to be, right? So are we going to say that's just like maybe a string to start with, right? All right. So that's cool. We define it as a string. And so now we know that, hey, look, our intent when writing this code is that coffee, that class field is going to store a string value, right?
Yeah.
But we still have strict mode on right now. Is that correct?
We do, yes.
Okay. So now with strict mode, it's not just about making sure that we have types, but it's making sure that we're using the types in a way that can help us be most successful. So we can see that like the message there of the error says that we don't have an initializer for that value, right?
Exactly.
So now how do we think about solving that?
Yeah, and that's more so, and this isn't necessarily types. This is just some helpers as you're creating your code that's saying, hey, you've got this property defined and it's type string, but you're never actually setting it. And it needs to be set either here or we could set it in the constructor. So if we have that here and we initialize it here, that error should go away.
This is what I love about going through like code examples and things like that. There's so many little moments and just something so simple to describe and learn from things, right? Because this is going to unfold great. Like we just set the default value right in the constructor, so we've got that. We also have coffee typed as a type string up there at the top, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've got everything happy with our strict mode, so we're all good. But there's some other things that we could do here, right? We could leverage type inference here for our coffee and the syntactic sugar that TypeScript provides by setting our input of coffee to a default value outside of the constructor, right?
But I think that the pattern that's typically followed is to use setting it where you're defining it versus setting it in the constructor for these types of properties, unless it needs some other initialization or something else to help initialize it.
So like this right here is that we're saying, look, we've got an input, we got a class field named coffee. We're decorating with the input decorator. So Angular knows that we want to treat it as an input, a property that can be bound to. And then we're setting it, we're using TypeScript syntactic sugar to set it to a default value of an empty string. So that as soon as this Alyssa component gets instantiated, it will have coffee as a class field and it will be instantiated to an empty string to start with.
Exactly.
Right?
But we can clean things up a little bit because by having this value here or this type on that property, TypeScript is actually smart enough to know that if you're assigning it to a string, and to be clear, that's 2 single ticks, so that's the equivalent of 2 double quotes. I didn't want somebody to think that it was just a single double quote there. But anyway, TypeScript is smart enough to realize that if you're assigning it to a string, that the type of coffee will be a string. And I turned off my hovers, so because I get annoyed by that. I hover over that, it knows that the type of coffee is string. The type of coffee is a string because we're assigning it to a string. So that's one way to make our code less verbose. And if we decide later on that this should become an object,
mm-hmm.
and in here type is a string,
mm-hmm.
This
Why
is
it so?
Because that's your object literal,
yeah,
not your typing.
And this could then also have a type associated with it that is type is a string. Why does it not like that? Because I'm putting it in the wrong place.
Yeah. So
I could have done that with an as, but that's okay.
So, at the heart of TypeScript, the initial design of it was about bringing the ability to strong type JavaScript, which is not strongly typed, right? So when we create a variable in JavaScript, we can set it to a string and then later set it to an object, and JavaScript's fine with that.
That ticks off a lot of people, right? In the typing community. Doesn't that upset them like deeply at like a core level of like, if it's a string, it should never be anything other than a string. And it like, because at this point, couldn't we just override?
Well, that's what, so TypeScript's providing us that ability to say, hey, look, I want to define this as a string and I don't want any other code in the application to be changing it from a string to an object on me. And I want to know about it when I'm writing the code, right? And so TypeScript is going to be that layer that helps us say, hey, the intent of this is to be a string. Stop anybody that tries to write code in this library and tell them like, hey, you're trying to change an object. You can't do that because it's defined as a string, right?
Does it still work that way though if you're inferring? Like, so like when he had it as like equals an empty string, couldn't we later on just be like equals an array and it would just take it? Or no, that's JavaScript, not TypeScript. Like even if you're inferring, it still yells at you.
Yeah, so that's what, like TypeScript is. We're using TypeScript to get, put typing on these variables, right? And then by that inference, we're able to say, okay, since TypeScript's job at the heart of it is to help us have strong type things, right?
Yeah.
It's saying, oh, hey, I got you. You set me to an initial value. I'm going to figure out what that should be strongly typed as for you. TypeScript is doing that for us, right? And so then as a result, at that point, we are getting the strong typing for that class field or variable or whatnot. But we're not having to be verbose about when we declare it as a type in our code, because TypeScript says, it's like syntactic sugar essentially at that point. So TypeScript says, oh, I got you. You set it to a string. Now I know your intent is that it's a string. So it's always going to need to be a string.
While you were talking, I did a whole lot of typing, but I wanted to explain that. So Chow asked in chat if the reason that the build succeeded, even though we were seeing the error that we see now on the screen,
yes,
was because this component class wasn't being utilized at all. So we had this TypeScript file inside of our project, but nothing was actually importing it. Nothing was using it. So it was like, whatever, I don't really care. You're not really getting compiled anyway. So what I did real quick is in the module, I declared it. So Alyssa, you're not part of the module.
Yeet.
And then I also utilized it so it didn't get tree shaken out as well. And then in here, I just reverted back to where we were, and the build does fail because
now you're getting that. That's good. Okay. Okay.
So long explanation, but the answer is yes. That's why it wasn't.
Will you prove Shorty's point real quick and like equals it to a string so it's being inferred, and then try to equals it to something else later and get the error?
Do you want to see like build errors?
I don't care. Errors.
It's like create a class method, right? And then try and set coffee equal to an object or something inside of that class method.
One. This is what you're talking about?
Yeah.
And that won't run either. Like it's
no, TypeScript will fail on that because
they'll stop the boat. Okay.
Yeah, we're basically trying at this point, exactly as it says, we're trying to set a number to something that is type string.
It was one of the quirky things that like I loved about JavaScript was just this like mushability, like
the freedom to just do
the
whatever.
Freedom, yes. Yeah. So now I'm like, oh, all right.
So I agree with you. That freedom is great. However, what it does is it exposes potential bugs to your users. And for me, my reasoning of liking TypeScript and seeing this here, and while this won't necessarily blow up for a user because JavaScript is not type safe, is that I get this feedback at dev time and I catch my errors versus users catching it when they run the application.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but to your point, Alyssa, like this is something we talked about in the last episode of the fact that like at the end of the day, we're given a set of rules by whatever, syntax that we're using, whatever language that we're using. And we have the freedom as developers to craft whatever we're going to craft to fit whatever needs we need to fit. Right. And that's different for everybody. So like Mike mentioned, this has this comfort, this helps in something that he's working on or he's pursuing, right? But that's not like the end all be all that defines every developer should do it this way or every developer, the experience needs to be this way, right? It's more about this has its benefits, but anything that is really we're just driven by the requirements of the compiler and then things like that, and then from there it's whatever we make it to fulfill whatever we're trying to fulfill. At least that's how I kind of approach it.
Yeah, no, I do see though, like the point of, especially watching my husband last week, they released a huge update and I think he spent an entire day just putting out fires for production bugs that people were finding, and it was like 911 all day. And so I feel like, yeah, if you can help your team avoid anything that the client, any pains that the client sees, like, or I can see that too, but it would have to fit your app and your flow and your group of peeps. So let's see. Button click. What are you doing with drink more coffee? What are you doing here?
Setting up a method to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever you drink,
he's just free painting right now, just going at it while we're talking.
Hey, we decided to show some code, so we need to have some code. So
I love
Mike's
it.
like,
I love it.
You asked me to type. You asked me to share my screen in live code, and this is what you get. And I
would like to see the button now, please. Could you render the app? Thank you. Also, if you turn strict mode,
I'm just sharing the VS Code. I'm not sharing.
If you turn strict mode off, you obviously can build it, and it will be like, it will allow you to do funky monkeys, but will it still give you the warnings?
Right.
Oh, some, not all monkeys.
So let's say here, right? So let's go back and we'll go back to our TS config, and we'll turn this back to false, and then we'll try and rebuild. So before I run this, let's take a look at what I just did. Is I'm now trying to set this
.coffee. Is it still yelling at you though?
Number. Yeah. So even though strict mode is off, where's my TS config file? It's right here. The strict mode is off. There are still TypeScript checks being done. It's just less strict.
So
false.
When we change our file from JS to TS, and we use TypeScript to transpile our JavaScript,
yes,
we can still write JavaScript for the most part. There's still some caveat, right? Because we've activated TypeScript, and because TypeScript will do type inference, we start getting these checks and we start getting these failed builds as a result of TypeScript saying, oh, hey, you told me I need to be on watch for this.
Right.
Like, you can still write whatever, just, you don't have to write typing anywhere, but because you told me to be on watch, because I'm part of the equation, now I'm going to catch these things and tell you about them, right? Or fail the build. So there is a level of, I'm adopting TypeScript into the pipeline. It does come with some things that are going to happen. So now, Alyssa, if you want to change coffee to a number instead of a string, that JavaScript allows you to do, the TypeScript, build process,
it's still not actually
nope,
building.
Not going to happen, right?
Okay. Did you see Chow's question? I thought it was interesting, but I don't know. Are we ready for that?
I think that's a good question that we should talk about. So I'm just making a quick change here, that instead of necessarily having the property of coffee, let's do this having type, and we'll initialize that to coffee.
All right. And really quick on the inference, right? Like, we saw that, we can change beverage we can have beverage have a type on it and then have the value set it. But if we leverage type inference, then we don't have to have a type on that we define as beverage, right? And then if something else is using our class of Alyssa component and tries to access beverage, type inference and TypeScript will tell us what type it is and what type it's expecting, right?
Yeah.
So can we see that real quick? Show it, Mike. Oh, you don't want to.
So we don't need to necessarily go down a road of saying, oh, well, now this component has to have an interface for its input, and we have to export that so other things can use that and import that interface and now be tightly coupled to that component and whatnot, because
like
we can
a faux
leverage type
interface
inference,
that comes with
right?
it. Yeah. Ooh.
So type inference, I feel, is very powerful, right? In terms of if we can lean into using it, right?
I need to blah, 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 blah.
Justin, the way you're making it sound though, is that it's like whenever we share this with something else and it sees like kind of like the signature of what it needs, you're only getting that with type inference. Like if you're explicitly doing it, it's not going to show that. Like,
what I'm kind of describing is something that we'll hopefully land on here in a little bit, which is, when we have this input, right, Mike wrote of beverage, and it's an object, it's going to expect an object, right? Like, how do we surface the fact that, like, if somebody's using this component, that input, that value that they're going to hand it for beverage should look like this shape, right? I don't know where you're going now.
Well, we get it. We're talking about inference, right?
Provided in root.
So now we know what the type is of this input, even though we're not defining one or in here, but it knows what type is being returned from this function. And that gets inferred here of the type that is being supplied as part of the component.
Okay, so yeah, so if you kind of like
rather than
your
going
eyes to the
component
input,
to component,
right?
Hold on, instead of going to component, I defined a type in a service and how it passes around through there.
So we have this drink service, and it has a method called init beverage, and it's going to return an object, right?
Yeah.
Now you notice that init beverage doesn't have an interface on it of what it returns, right? We didn't define that in TypeScript, right? And then when we use it on line 17, we're calling in init beverage. We have beverage over there set to that. Still no types up there that we defined on it, right? But if we mouse like when Mike hovered his mouse over there, you see that TypeScript is going to tell us, oh, I know what beverage is. It's an object that looks like this with a type property of string because it's inferring it from the init beverage method call. And again, the init beverage method call doesn't have a signature to describe what it is, but because it has a return statement, TypeScript is looking into that and saying, oh, this returns an object that looks like this. So I can TypeScript, I can infer that, right? So now from a developer standpoint, we get visibility into what the API looks like, how we need to use it, without having to take on the extra effort of writing types everywhere, right?
Yes.
And so this becomes a big benefit. I see this as a big benefit because we get the value of strong typing. We get the value of ensuring our resiliency of our applications and the understanding of how to use these methods and how to use these properties, right? But we don't get tightly coupled into slinging types all over the place. Because if drink service is in another file, in another spot that we have to, and we wanted to, ship an interface for that method, we'd have to export that interface. We'd have to import it wherever else we're using if we wanted to leverage the interface all over the place, right?
Yes.
And it's certainly viable and certainly something we can do. But when we start thinking about decoupling and partitioning our code and reusability of our code, it quickly becomes a challenge if we're saying, like, I wrote this little code over here. I want it to be consumed at A, B, and C. If I have to chuck interfaces around, now I need all those things to also be able to bring that import interface in. And then if something uses those and I want those to use the same interface, now I'm sending that interface to these other places. And it quickly can couple your code and make it harder to take that code out and reuse it somewhere else without understanding the coupling, right?
But often our data isn't as simple as I have it right here and it's this like object with a type of coffee, like type of string coffee. Like often we have to like go and get it from somewhere else. Are we ever worried about the timing of that? Like, do you just give it a default then of what it should look like? And then essentially you're using an interface that looks different than an interface. You see what I'm saying?
A lot of times, and to your point, that maybe this value isn't coming directly from here. Maybe it's coming from an observable from a remote data call, an API call to be able to get what that is. And we have no knowledge of what is actually coming back there. So that's when we define an interface, either implicitly here and actually, or explicitly, sorry, if you were to type it as part of your application or potentially import it in from another library that may be shared across the front end and back end. But
I mean, if you already know, because if you can define an interface for what it should look like, what you're receiving back, then you kind of do know the structure of what you're receiving, which means instead of defining an interface, you could just set it equal to something that as soon as the observable finishes, you can reassign it, right? And like you're getting that same detachment from decoupling.
You are, because essentially what this would be, right? Saying that this thing here is returning this type. That's an interface, right? And then when I hover over this, it's going to tell me not just it's an object literal with a property type that's of type string. It says, hey, this is a beverage. And there's nothing in this class that knows that of what beverage is. It just knows, hey, this function that you have here, it's returning this thing called a beverage. And I don't even need to specify it there. I can get rid of that and say this thing that I'm returning is a beverage. So this object literal is of type beverage. So I'm returning that thing as this. which means that this knows that it returns a beverage, which means it's known up here and it still flows through without setting the type. So it's two different ways to set the type here. But I still prefer the previous way.
Does providing input data in HTML template for a list of component type safe?
Providing input data.
So like go to your app component and bind to the property for beverage, right?
Yep. And then this needs to be an object, which isn't really going to help us out. Let me go into the app component code.
Yeah, create an object right there. Just
can you use as like right there too?
Mm-mm.
Sorry, Alyssa, you're drinking tea today.
Now change that type to be types. Yeah, there you go.
Huh?
So it's telling me that this thing doesn't exist on there.
Will it not take it? Like if you provided type and an extra blip it, would it not take it? Because you only defined one blip it.
I love this question. It's great. It's gonna give me a talking point.
Is it angry? I think
Yeah.
it's angry. It's angry.
Okay, so I believe this is the Angular language service that's doing this, right? That's empowering this to understand, like I'm looking at an HTML file, it's an Angular file. So I'm going to look at this Angular input. I'm going to try and work with TypeScript to figure out what the type is of beverage, right? So we can now see that like we've got this type safety in our template because our beverage has an inferred type, right? And again, if we go back to the Alyssa component, right? We crafted this Alyssa component. We didn't add a type to this beverage because it's inferred, right? So we don't have to sling that beverage interface around, right? Because again, we're getting the beverage model from init beverage. Then we start quickly getting into a situation where we're like, oh, well, this input of beverage is of type beverage, which came from the service. So I import that from that interface. And then up the stream, something else that calls this component needs to prep a beverage model. Do I import that interface of beverage up there? Yeah. And where did that interface come from? It quickly unfolds into like a coupling scenario that gets challenging to manage over time. And so
couldn't you just make sure that your interface is in the same file so it's not separate, or so like it's exported together? Is that not a thing? Was that a pattern I saw? So your interface doesn't get it exported separately. It's like already with it.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly can, right? Like, and that kind of goes along the concept of thinking about like each of individual little chunk of thing that you provide. If it has an API, it can provide its own API surface description, right?
Yeah.
And maybe API surfaces look the same. And this kind of really falls into domain-driven design and the concept of bounded context and things like that, where we talk about, you have something that's responsible for something, and its responsibility is to handle this data in a certain way. You may have another thing that does something that works with the same shape of data. And your instinct might be to say, well, those two shapes of data are the same, so let me put them somewhere and just consume them in both places. Yeah. There's benefit because you say, well, that kind of makes it the same in you're adding one spot. But there's drawbacks because you coupled both implementations, which are really separate, to the same thing, the same object structure. And now if you say, a great example of this that I usually use is like an address, right? And you have an address object, and maybe it starts off with, in this scenario, you need just address line 1. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, in this situation, I need address line 1 and 2. If I update that shared model to have address line 1 and 2, the thing over here, the previous thing, didn't need address line 2. So now I've got extra stuff that it needs to deal with, right?
Right.
And so that's the challenge of saying I'm going to use a shared model across different domains, is that now you're like, well, it's one size fits all. And so now you have to make sure it works for everything, rather than having each domain control its own surface, even if they look the same, because it's really, low effort to copy paste. And the value with type inference is that if we're not chucking types around and we're not defining those, then TypeScript can tell us what the shape of it needs to look like. So we get the value that the shape is going to look the same without having to, define it somewhere else and have that coupling, but we still get the type safety.
Yeah. And I just to throw an address in there. So you talked about the idea of adding line 2 within here. Well, you may need to mark something like that as optional by putting a question mark, and that says that this property may or may not exist as part of this object.
Chow was asking about that, and I think Shorty said that he uses or null approach. I mean,
yeah. So
is there a problem with using the question mark?
Well,
there's
that's
not. So there's different
question.
ways to talk about this. So let's create 3 different inputs, right? So we have beverage, and delete this, delete that. Beverage 2, beverage 3. Bad idea, I understand, but to explain the concept. So what is happening? Do we have strict mode off? Strict mode is off. So let's turn that back on real quick. And what Chow was talking about, and hopefully the editor will pick this up pretty quickly. It's saying that we're not defining a type on this.
Yeah.
And even if we do, that actually throw the error here.
Where? What? What?
That the value isn't set. It's not being initialized there. Any doesn't work, but if you put a property in there, it's saying that there is no initializer for this. So we're saying that this is of type string, but because it's a string means that it can't be undefined or should not be undefined because it's a string. It's not undefined. It would be okay if I put or undefined. That's legit. Here, let's comment this one out for now. And just make a little bit of space. So doing that makes it okay because it's initialized and the initial value will be undefined, and that's legit. But if it's a string, how do we handle that? Or even more realistically, this is a beverage, but it's saying, hey, it never gets initialized to have a beverage. And what Chow's asking is that there's 2 different ways that he's proposing in there to talk about that. One, you could say, hey, it's optional. So you don't have to supply it, and TypeScript says, oh, well, that doesn't have to be there, so I don't need to necessarily provide a value for that. So I'm good with that. The other option is to say, TypeScript, I know that it's a beverage and I'm not initializing it, but I promise you, I'm telling you that a value will be there. And that's what the exclamation is doing.
I've never seen the exclamation used.
It's me telling the compiler that value will be there. I know you don't see it, but I promise it'll be there, and I'm okay with it. That is the most
bizarre. Why on earth would you need to? Have you guys ever honestly been like, oh, thank God that exists? Because I'm like, that sounds. I don't know that.
So this question came up when when Angular went to the idea of having strict mode by default. Because I can't tell you how many applications I've been in that have this code in it. Says, hey, I'm creating this input and it's of this type and we're good. You just need to pass it in and we're good. But because most of the applications weren't strict by default, this error started to manifest when they moved this code into a TypeScript strict compilation mode. So that's why it's become a conversation. So the 2 different main ways of handling 3. One, say, hey, don't worry about it. A value will be there. It's optional. Don't worry about it. Being undefined is okay, but then you have to add checks for it later on because when I come down to use this dot beverage 2, telling me that the value over and over that can be beverage or undefined.
Right.
The other option is to supply an actual value to it. And type blah, blah, blah.
I thought or null was another option.
Or null, yes. So you could actually, I don't think or null would work because by default, the value of this is undefined.
Undefined.
And null and undefined are 2 different things. Bigger JavaScript quote.
Now here's where it gets real crazy, right? Is that as if it's not crazy enough, right? What we're trying to solve here is this type safety and this usage right here, right? But lines start to get blurred when we start thinking about the fact that we're doing this on an input for a component, right? And the input for the component is really the property binding in the DOM, right? Which is not, it's separate from that. Let's say we ship this component as an Angular element to be used elsewhere, right? we no longer have visibility or control over what gets handed to that property, right? So we can write all the typing we want till we're blue in the face here for our component, but that's still not going to completely ensure that it's going to get used. The input field is going to get used as we intended it, right? And it's not going to ensure that some of the code might not make it to production and being used in the wrong way.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing of, while we can say, hey, we really want our components to always set this, while we talked about this being an error, right? If I put in foo bar, that's invalid.
Yeah.
Right. If I have another one of these and I don't even set beverage, that's completely fine. And that's to Justin's point that we don't know what we're going to get from the idea of outside of Angular, but even inside of Angular. I'm not setting that property. So how do I know what this value is? So while I love the idea of saying, don't worry about it, it'll be there, we'll be good, it's not always accurate. I don't like that. So personally, I've kind of been ignoring it because I haven't gone strict on the projects that I've been working on. But when I have to address it, I've typically been going with the question mark because I think that's the more realistic scenario, that it is optional. There's no way to enforce that value will be there for components or directives. But for services, that's a different story because that's just straight TypeScript where you don't have the browser mess getting in the way. But it truly is optional at this point. So there's a very good chance that this could be undefined. Now you try and enforce that in other ways with steps and manual steps within your project code review and what have you. But by saying that it's optional, that forces you to code defensively. So I know that as I start using this, it may be invalid. And my editor actually put that in there. But it may be undefined. So I know that I need to actually code and handle that and code defensively. And that's always a principle that I learned early in my dev career is to code defensively and don't take things for granted, especially when there's types involved, to be able to force myself to say, hey, look, that's a scenario that I need to handle.
And that's exactly it. That's where we get the value, right? Is that because of that runtime issue and because that's out of our control and these things can happen, what can we do to ensure it as much as we can? And by doing what Mike is showing, that enforces us when we write our code to have to do these null guard checks, right? And we want those because, again, we have no control over beverage 2 coming in from whatever source. It could be undefined. It could come as a different shape. Like our transpilation of our code doesn't 100% guarantee that we protected ourselves, right, from the way that that's used. So the only way we can kind of really get there, or one of the ways we can get there, is by ensuring that we're doing these null checks and these null guards when we go to use that class field. So this is telling us, hey, when we write that code, TypeScript's going to say, oh, yo, you forgot your null guard there. You told us that should be important, so we're on the lookout for you. Make sure you add that. And then Vader comes in and
I know, I was like, that was
sorry. I have a meeting at 1 that I was just letting them know that I'll be a few minutes late. No big deal.
We are at the top of the hour, so we should wrap up. Now we just got into a little bit of it. See, like
I know topics, there's so much more on types.
All right. So what I want to show one last thing because I'm going to make a part of my pick. And this is actually something that Chow showed me, or I learned from him, is that in here, this event emitter is of type any. But say I want anytime that we want to emit the beverage that was drank. Okay, not just the count. So in here, we have to give it a type. And rather than giving it a beverage, we can actually make it a little bit cleaner because that's dependent upon this service, right? We're getting the beverage from the service.
Yes.
So we can actually say that this needs to be based off of the return type, which is built into TypeScript. And this is going to be from the, I believe it is.
Type of?
Huh? Yeah.
Type of.
Yeah. Thank you. Drink service dot. How do I access that function? Is this dot drink service? There.
Can you do this dot beverage?
Say that again.
Can you do this dot beverage instead of this dot drink service dot init beverage?
I could. So because they do have the same type, but it's not a return type.
One more.
You're missing
one more
closing bracket.
chevron.
But even still, this dot beverage isn't a return type.
Return type.
Yeah, it's angry.
Return type
because it's not a function.
From a function, yeah.
But this is saying that the type of this event emitter is the type that is coming out of this function. So down the road, if I come back and I say, all right, this isn't going to return a beverage, this is going to return, I don't know, foo, which may happen to have the same signature or a different signature. If this becomes foo and we change that in the service,
yeah,
this automatically gets updated and propagated through and inferred all the way through.
Return type of.
That's too much for a Friday.
It's
so awesome.
Can we talk about that one on the next episode? Just like slow that one down a little.
See, that's a segue. That's a segue. Because there's a set of types within TypeScript, and they're called, what is it? Utility types.
Oh yeah, that we wanted to go over, right?
Yes. So
And
I wanted
about,
that my pick is going to be that
unobscure
URL where the
some of
utility types
them?
are.
Okay.
But return type is a utility type that allows you to build other types based off of that.
Do you guys want to do a part 2 for this for next week, or do you want to do another subject potentially? Okay.
Yeah. All right. That was awesome.
Yeah, Chow agrees. Type inference is a whole episode on its own.
It's very powerful. I like it a lot in terms of, still getting the type safety that we're looking for, but being able to partition our code up for more reuse and less coupling. So inference for the win. All right. Should we do some picks? Mike already had his pick, unless you have another pick.
Nope. Utility types is good. I don't think I have any other picks.
All right. I shared that link in the chat. So
can you share this? It's not a link, but it's just the text. My pick is The Name of the Wind, The Kingkiller Chronicle. It's book 1 for those of you who are like me and love really long series that are already released. This is not it. He's still writing book 3, but fantastic world, amazing writing. 10 out of 10. I'm on book 2 now, so I only have like 40 hours left of enjoyment, which really breaks my heart, but it's good.
Did they reveal the name of the wind or?
No. So it's kind of, there's a lot of magic in this world, and there's kind of a type of magic called naming. And if you know like the true names of things, you can control them. So the name of the wind was a big part of that plot. And so I don't know. Nice. I'm all about that, the fantasy world. So it's so good though. You gotta read it if you're into books like that. It's
sounds so wizard. Awesome. All right. Well, my pick, and you're gonna have to help me out with my pick because I want to pick the conference that's coming up, the DevReach conference.
Yay!
So maybe you can fill in the details of that.
But
that's my pick. I heard that there's some magical stuff going on there.
So we're kind of upsetting. Here's the link. We're kind of upsetting Shorty because Mike is going to be speaking there, and he and I are talking about renting Vespas or mopeds, some sort of amazing, rideable that we can have fun with, making Shorty jealous. But it's going to be really cool. It's in Boston this fall. Check out the link in the chat. Ticket sales are now open. And I'm really, really pumped. We're actually even going to have, so Jeff Welpley has an Angular community meetup in Boston. And so we'll have them come in one night, the first night of the conference, and host a meetup at DevReach, Angular Boston at DevReach. And so it's going to be really cool. So if you're in the area, at least come by for that meetup, but if nothing else, but we'd love to see you. Mike, what's your talk about? I have 40 speakers I'm juggling. So I'm like,
I'm writing a talk, still working on it, of writing less framework specific code. So ways to write your applications that are not tightly coupled to the framework that you're using.
We actually have quite a few people who don't even do Angular that now like are hang out in our chat. And so we do have a .NET track, a JavaScript track, which will have things outside of Angular like React. I know, gosh, there's a lot of React lovers in the world, but I'm really excited. We also have a miscellaneous track that we named Mosaic. I don't know, I thought that was a fun name, that we're doing a lot of things like accessibility, UI, UX, testing, etc. So I don't know, even soft talks. I think it's be amazing. So come and join us. It's got something for everybody, but just not a shorty for everybody. Sad face.
I'll be there in heart.
I
thought you were gonna print a picture out of my face and carry it around on like a popsicle stick and be like,
I will, but I don't want people getting it like no, I will totally do that. I just don't want people being upset that they get the popsicle stick version of you and not the real version, right? Like they need a warning.
You want me? I can record some audio files. You could tape it to the back and just play it.
It'll be basically the same.
Hey, welcome. Yeah, I could do that, stuff like that.
Gotta make sure it's really strong tape for the moped, right?
Put a shorty on it.
Put a shorty on it. Oh God, I love it. Thank you guys for the fun episode. This was great.
All right. Yeah, that's a wrap. Thanks, everyone. That was awesome. Catch you next time. See ya.
Bye.